One of the things I can't get out of my head about the early days of COVID-19 was the Madonna bathtub video, where she called COVID the great equalizer.
That's the thing about COVID-19. It doesn't care about how rich you are, how famous you are. It's the great equalizer. And what's terrible about it is what's great about it. What's terrible about it is it's made us all equal in many ways.
I don't know what Madonna was thinking there, but COVID was no great equalizer. What it truly was and is a great accelerator. The pandemic had this quality of speeding already existing outcomes. Black Americans were already more likely to be unemployed than other groups. COVID-19 heightened that disparity. E-commerce was already gaining steam. COVID-19 is hastening its rise. Department stores were already struggling. COVID-19 is hastening their decline. The introduction of automation and other digitization tools in the workplace was already taking place. COVID-19 is making it happen quicker. We could go on and on and on, but you get the point. Most people expect significant technology-induced changes in the workplace. A lot of it will be good, and generally, it's just a bad idea to fight against the march of technology and innovation. But these changes are unlikely to be neutral. They could worsen inequality and leave behind many poor and low-income people unless public policy is more thoughtful and forward-looking. In this series, I speak with experts, journalists, scholars, activists, and business people on the future of work. What kinds of changes do we expect to see? What kinds of impacts, good or bad, would be unleashed by remote work, automation, artificial intelligence, and more digitization? How do we make sure that society leaves no one behind? We'll discuss policy ideas like guaranteed income, upskilling, empowering unions, regulating the gig economy, and many, many more. My name is Stanley Azuakola. Welcome to episode 1 of The Future of Work in a post-COVID-19 world.
The future of work is going to be flexible.
The future of work is likely to get better for the majority of people, assuming we have the right policies in place.
I think the future of work is going to be remote.
The future of work is going to be a revitalized and reimagined service sector that includes just and equitable opportunities for all.
The future of work is going to be just.
The future of work is going to be full of opportunities for some and full of risk for others.
The future of work is going to become increasingly polarized between people with good jobs and people with bad jobs, between the haves and the have-nots, unless we work very hard to make it otherwise.
The future of work is going to be about our humanity.
The future of work is going to be unpredictable.
Everyone feels it. Some things about work are changing. The way we work, where we work, who we work for, and what rewards we're entitled to for the work we do. But it's fair to say we do not yet know the full extent of this shift. The most visible change since COVID-19 struck has been the adoption of remote work for white-collar workers. Remote work feels great for those whose jobs allow it.
I think is really huge. I think it is. It's kind of an equity issue, honestly, for if someone has health problems, or they're a caretaker for an elderly person, or they have children. So it doesn't matter if you have a family or not. I also think it's really an equalizer in terms of forcing people to live in places that may be expensive, that may have housing crises that are just the product of, frankly, of bad management in terms of the local or state government. So I think that remote work can be an equalizer. And I think that it can just lead to much better working conditions for...
I think for a subset of workers, the pandemic is actually going to be a big improvement in their work practices long term. Why do I say that? I think the pandemic has forced companies and people to overcome the kind of fixed costs of transitioning to models of more flexible work, more remote work, investing in the technology, figuring out how to build teams and relationships remotely. And that's going to really help many of the workers, largely who are in white collar type professional jobs, and it's particularly who don't want to have to live close to their work, who don't want to have to commute every day. And I think it's particularly going to help women longer term in the workforce, who maybe in the past would have been victims of working practices that largely didn't allow flexible or remote work, didn't allow people to be at home for some periods of the week, or not traveling for business meetings or conferences. And so the long-term persistence of remote work, I think, will be good, particularly for professional women.
But there are several challenges with remote work. Some of them are things you expect technology to progressively solve.
That right now, the technology is serviceable to do the kinds of things that people were previously doing in person in offices, but it's not optimal. And so I do worry that we won't be able to necessarily accelerate collaboration the way that we otherwise might have.
But there are other challenges of remote work that are trickier policy issues without easy fixes, where finding win-win solutions for everybody is tough.
The proliferation of remote work is going to provide a huge challenge for workers in advanced economies, even as it provides a huge opportunity for workers in developing economies. Right. And this is really exciting in terms of poverty alleviation, but it's really worrying in terms of inequality and social stability in places like the US. Once remote work is possible, why would a company want to employ expensive workers in the US remotely when it could employ equally good, equally well qualified workers remotely in a different country, in an emerging economy, at a much lower cost?
Right.
So this transition to remote work, I think, is going to massively accelerate service sector outsourcing, and the pace of that change is going to be hard for countries like the US to manage.
So a lot is riding on policy. That's one of the things you would hear often in this series. When it comes to remote work, how policymakers in countries like the United States react to its double-edged impact will be one of the most critical themes in the future of work. Something else to watch is the impact of automation, digitization, and artificial intelligence. Are robots coming to take our jobs? Will artificial intelligence complement us or replace us? These technologies are expected to be good for productivity in the long term, but how much of a dislocation would they cause to the workforce? A study by the Fed showed that most of the jobs lost to automation during the pandemic are not coming back. The jobs most at risk of being replaced by machines include hotel desk clerks, shuttle drivers, retail salespersons, parking attendants, slaughterhouse workers, and toll collectors. These are low-income workers. The Fed study also showed that the effect was more pronounced for minority workers. Jobs held by minority workers experienced 5.1 more job losses per 100 jobs than those held by white people.
The entire model of the restaurant industry has been totally upended. So for a while now, we were talking about how automation might affect the service sector and restaurants and retail establishments. But now we're seeing it to this extreme where it's actually the only way that some corporations are going about business, especially the large corporations that have lobbying power. And so that not just is it affecting the worker directly, whereas maybe you don't have a server going up to your table anymore, but you're scanning your phone to get a QR code to get the menu, and then you can order directly on, an app or something. But then we're seeing also, like, at the national level, where companies are using the corporations that have lobbied to keep workers' wages low and to keep protections down for a long time are using this as kind of like, look, see, this is what we told you. This is the way that things are going anyways. And now the pandemic has just exacerbated it.
Many experts argue that these changes and dislocations are bound to happen, that society just has to find a way to support the transitioning of affected people into new, stable careers filled with opportunities.
Circumstances. For example, you have the coal industry in the United States, and the world is moving away from coal, and it's moving away from coal for very good reasons. But there are communities who's built their entire way of life around that industry. And so you need to think through what is the best way of ensuring that these workers, these people who have families and households that they need to support, make sure that they can transition into the jobs that are in existence. And frankly, there are jobs that are growing, even as shifts in the economy have moved jobs away from particular areas. Other areas have benefited. It's not just the computer programmers, which everybody talks about, where I think there are more people who could benefit from upskilling in high tech areas, but also in nursing, also, you know, in home health aides, you know, so really we need to be targeted and thoughtful about who is being left behind, and then think about sort of the best way to transition.
Now is a good time to point out that in our current version of capitalism, holding a job carries no guarantee of receiving a fair share. In the past 4 decades, while aggregate productivity in the United States has risen by more than 75%, the median worker has seen less than a 20% increase in compensation. If we combine the two themes I have just highlighted, we could possibly have a situation where on the one hand, there is a risk of job losses due to technology-induced changes. And on the other hand, even though productivity may rise, low-income workers who remain in the workforce may not partake in the resulting gains.
Between automation and digitization, it's clear that we are seeing this bifurcation in the economy, right? It's a dumbbell-shaped distribution of workers where you hollow out the middle class. You have more people. Let's not forget that the ranks of the wealthiest and best compensated workers have also increased, even as the ranks of the lowest paid workers have also increased. So you're seeing a polarization in the economy in terms of who has what wages, who has what wealth, who has what benefits, who has a salary versus being an hourly worker, who gets to dictate their schedule versus those who have no control over their schedule, who's doing the kind of work where they're more likely to be injured or just suffer a psychic injury of doing, so-called dull, dirty, and dangerous.
The situation is more challenging for a particular subset of service workers, those earning sub-minimum wages by law. The federal minimum wage in the United States is about $7.50 an hour. It rises in a few states to as much as $15. But for tipped workers like nail salon technicians, restaurant workers, tech platform delivery workers and drivers, hairdressers, and many more, wages are usually way less. The federally mandated sub-minimum wage for these tipped workers is just $2.13 an hour. It is $5 or less in nearly 40 states, with workers expected to make up the rest with tips.
Federal tipped minimum wage is $2.13 an hour. That is unacceptable. Any job that pays $2.13 an hour is not a job. It's indentured servitude. I remember working in restaurants and you would have someone say something extremely inappropriate to you, or you'd have someone touch you. And the thing is it would be the 28th of the month, the 29th of the month. And the first of the next month was rolling right around and you had a rent check to pay. And so you are more likely to stand up for yourself and to reject sexual harassment on the 15th of the month, or maybe the 10th of the month, when you could pick up an extra shift to make up for telling that guy to go buzz off. Able enough wage to reject sexual harassment, to say I'm not going to take that degrading shift, to say I am going to work a shift on my terms and I'm going to work on my terms because we have lives and we have children to take care of, and we shouldn't have to work 80-hour weeks so that our kids can have a meal at lunch.
That was New York Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a campaign put together by the One Fair Wage Coalition, which is advocating for an end to all sub-minimum wages in the United States. I spoke with a communication strategist at One Fair Wage, Yamila Ruiz, about why this campaign is important.
We are pushing this campaign to eradicate this legacy of slavery, which is a cause for harassment and discrimination, because a lot of times because the worker has to put up with whatever a customer might do or say to them in order to earn a tip. that opens a door to a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of discrimination. We've seen sexual harassment rates skyrocket in this pandemic, where women are being told things like, oh, you should take off your mask so I can decide how much to tip you. So not only is it a public health crisis, it's an economic crisis for these workers, and it's a crisis of harassment and discrimination as well.
In recent times, it has become fashionable to explain away bad outcomes for workers as something that can't be helped, a certain consequence of technological breakthroughs in the workplace. But Taylor Isenberg, the Executive Director of the Economic Security Project, and Anna Stansbury, Inequality and Social Policy Scholar at Harvard, both told me that bad outcomes for workers are not inevitable. They are the result of policy choices that we make.
I think there is definitely a technological effect that particularly more recently that we've seen have its impact. But the disconnect between wages and productivity is also connected to a few other policy choices that we made roughly 40 to 50 years ago. Some of that has to do with the role of labor unions. So there's definitely an important role that they played in making sure wages did rise with productivity, with the decline of the percentage of the workforce that is unionized. That has been a contributing factor. The minimum wage has not kept up. So that's another, I don't have the top numbers off the top of my head, but if you were to roughly have the equivalent of what the minimum wage was based on inflation back in the 1950s, the minimum wage today should be around $20, and it's around $7.25 and 15 depending on where you live. So there's a huge disconnect there, and that has contributed to this. And then I think it's just more broadly that we are seeing a similar effect in our economy that we saw in the 1920s before the Great Depression hit, which is a massive divergence between the people at the top and everyone else. So the accumulation of wealth at the top and the accumulation of power at the top over both our economy and democracy has the effect of getting more power and getting more resources. And so driving that divergence is a factor of our tax system. It's a factor of the concentration of industries. It's the factor of disinvestment in some of our basic public services like education. So all of those things are complex factors that are contributing to the state of the economy we have today. And I think what it fundamentally comes down to is this question of, do markets just exist and we have to deal with them as they are, or do we structure markets and we ask who we're structuring those markets for? And AI and technology, for example, can either work on behalf of workers or against them. That's a policy choice.
So I see this divergence between the gains that the economy makes from technology and the gains that the typical worker makes is caused by three factors. One is technological progress being biased towards complementing the productivity of workers that tend to have higher education, but substituting away from the workers that tend to have less education, so it exacerbates inequality. One is the increase in globalization, as I mentioned, where middle class and lower income jobs from advanced economies are outsourced. But the thing that I focused on in my work that I think is very important and underemphasizes this decline in worker power, which is essentially the decline in the ability of predominantly lower income and middle income workers to actually share in the gains that they play a part in generating. And that decline in worker power is something that has been largely policy driven and driven by institutions and norms, not by some untouchable secular technological or globalization forces that we can't change.
So how should we think about policy responses and solutions that provide for an equitable economy?
I think in order to kind of reimagine a revitalized service sector, we have to think about these workers at the forefront. We have to think about policies that support women, people of color, and empower them. So things like fair scheduling and limiting the subminimum wage for tech workers, empowering them through these worker protections and not rolling back protections like this administration is trying to currently do. So centering these stories, centering their narratives at the very heart of policymaking is going to be so crucial.
So I think first of all, it's like we need a set of policymakers to say and understand that when the bottom falls out, it doesn't fall out the same for everyone. And some people have a giant yacht to survive the storm, and some people are holding onto a piece of wood. And our policy responses need to understand those different experiences and respond in kind. So equity-based responses, race-forward responses that understands the role of racial disparities in outcomes, are all really critical, important things to integrate into any sort of policy responses. So any kind of policy that is put forward, we need to ask the question of how does this impact communities of color? How does this impact women? What are potential blind spots when it comes to meeting the needs of the most vulnerable? How do we make sure we're not leaving anyone behind? And how do we make sure we're not accidentally enriching some people at the expense of the many?
When the bottom falls out, it does not fall out the same way for everyone. So once again, a lot is riding on policy. In our next episode, and especially in our third and final episode, we'll spend some time talking about solutions that may fit the criteria for an equitable economy. But that's all the time we have on this episode. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to the MPA Program at the Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership at the City College of New York. I'm also grateful to my supervisor, Fatma Ashraf, and all the guests on this episode. My name is Stanley Azuakola. See you next time.